Chapter 8. The Concept of a Mature Creation. It has often been pointed out, frequently by scientists themselves, that much of the difference between ancient and contemporary science must be ascribed to the toolmaker who stands between men like Anton van Leeuwenhoek, who made possible a wider range of observation and activity. This fact leads to two very apparent conclusions. First, much of what man popularly ascribes to the theorist, as he marvels at the results of science, properly belongs to the neglected toolmaker. Second, while the results of modern theoretical science are often valid and acceptable from the biblical perspective, their validity no more guarantees the framework of secular scientific opinion than did the validity of much of Babylonian science underwrite Babylonian cosmology and scientific theory. In utilizing tools of various kinds as fashioned by diverse cultures, we are not thereby compelled to adopt those cultures. The fact that we use the Canaanite alphabet, for the Phoenicians were Canaanites, does not require us to do them honor. Baal worship upheld and was a religious expression of the concept of reality as process. The religious faiths of ancient Europe, the Far East, the Near East, and North Africa represented variations of a common myth, the Python concept of chaos and cosmos, and the history of creation, quote, as a process of bringing order out of chaos, end quote. Primitive American mythology cannot be definitely identified as derivative of the Python myth, but it does have, quote, surprising correspondences, end quote. While their relationship to the Python myth is questionable, the myths of the Americas are still clearly instances of faith in reality as process. Similarly, modern science has, according to Hoagland and Bryson, quote-unquote, one principle, which undergirds all its thinking about reality. As Bryson stated it, quote, this is the principle or the intellectual habit of thinking of all reality as process, end quote. The modern biologist goes further. Quote, life is a process, yes, but man himself is a process. His body is itself a process, and an exemplification of the principle of ancient Heraclitus, who said, all things flow, end quote. Heraclitus deified process. For him, being is a perpetual becoming, a continual about to be, so that the only unchanging thing is change. The implications of this position, clearly apparent in modern thought, are relativistic. All things are relative save process, and everything in man or his society is related to or made one with process. Thus, for Bryson, man's morals and customs are alike, quote, accidents of his time and place, end quote, and aspects of process. Accordingly, quote, the modern social scientist is unlikely to see much good purpose in the magnificent abstractions of good and evil, end quote. Indeed, man may, quote, be on his way toward creating a new human species, end quote. This is not a surprising conclusion or concern. Wherever there is faith in reality as process, man's problem is not ethical but metaphysical, not sin but finitude. The philosopher and theologian of process will seek to deify man or his society in order to transcend finitude. The scientist will seek to surpass man by recreating him as a god in process. The physicist Joseph Harold Rush, for example, believed that man would learn to control, quote, life processes, biology of his own species, end quote, and perhaps ultimately, having conquered both space and death, endlessly explore the universe. The whole point of the temptation in Genesis 3 was the insistence precisely that God's purpose in barring the tree of knowledge of good and evil was not ethical but metaphysical, not to keep man from sin, but to keep him from being, quote-unquote, as God, Revised Version. The insistence of autonomous man's mythology and science is that reality is in process, and that the essence of this process is not ethical, but cosmological, and in that sense, metaphysical. Since his epistemology is apostate, To deny that reality is in process, biological and cosmological, is for him to deny the possibility of knowledge. According to Hoagland, quote, George Wald points out that there are only two answers to the question of how life began. It must either have arisen spontaneously from non-living material or have been created by supernatural means. If one accepts the second answer, science has nothing to contribute, since the question cannot be resolved by the operational approaches of scientists, end quote. And if science has nothing to contribute, then the matter is settled against creation by the a priori assumptions of autonomous man. Questions which, quote, cannot be resolved by the operational approaches of scientists, end quote, are considered by their very nature impossible in terms of this anthropocentric view. Revelation must be ruled inadmissible precisely because it is revelation, and hence beyond man, who is creation's autonomous king and vanguard in the unfolding of process, and is now potentially able, it is held, to guide this process in his own case, and even to create new beings to be his servants, which will surpass God's handiwork. For, quote, when man synthesizes his own versions of biological systems, he will have the advantage of design, of intelligent forethought, end quote. The conflict between biblical religion and the science of autonomous man is real, necessary, and irreconcilable. Attention has been called to this conflict by Dr. Houston Smith, a professor of philosophy at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, in speaking, quote, of the program on which science has embarked, end quote. Quote, this program has 4 parts, he said. First, creation of life, which he said has almost been achieved already. Second, creation of minds, as evidenced by the analogy between the mind and thinking machines presently being pressed to the hilt. Third, creation of adjusted individuals via drugs, tranquilizers, and other chemistry. And fourth, creation of a good society via quote-unquote behavioral engineering, subliminal or otherwise. I personally don't see how this 4-fold program can be squared with religion, Dr. Smith said. To the extent that it, the program, is taken seriously, God is dead. To the extent that it becomes validated, God will be buried. Far from being a thing of the past, the conflict between science and religion may be shaping up in proportions greater than any we have thus far known, end quote. Against all this, the implications of the biblical position are clear-cut, and its declarations sharply challenging. In spite of every effort to allegorize Genesis 1, the meaning is textually clear. A 6-day creative work by God is asserted. Every attempt to adopt the framework hypothesis and invalidate the 6 days proves too much. Similar frameworks and patterns can be and have been read into the accounts of the virgin birth and the resurrection to undercut their meaning. As Marcus Dodds stated it, quote, if, for example, the word day in these chapters does not mean a period of 24 hours, the interpretation of Scripture is hopeless, end quote. Another common mode of misinterpreting Genesis 1 has been the attempt to translate Genesis 1:1 and part of verses 2 and 3 as a dependent clause. Quote-unquote absolute creation is ruled out by this construction, and quote-unquote pre-existing matter is placed side by side with God as the given. This interpretation, as Young has pointed out, is also untenable. Genesis 1 is perfectly clear in its declaration of a mature creation in 6 days. This cannot be ruled out as a quote-unquote poetic narrative without violence to the plain intent of Scripture and a consequent Barthian separation between faith and history. Genesis 1 mandates certain requirements for both science and religion which cannot be avoided. Basic to these requirements is the concept of a physically and biologically mature creation. This, even for evolutionists, is in a sense an inescapable concept, in that where a mature creation is denied, a mature potentiality must be asserted, a potentiality in the first Adam as mature, as the potentiality of an infinite universe in its infinite future. As Boardman long ago stated it in order to vindicate creative evolution, quote, suppose you say it came from a few cells or germs, or perhaps one. That does not answer the question. The axiom, "every effect must have a cause," implies another axiom: effects are proportional to their causes. That is to say, causes are measured by their effects. If the whole material universe came from a few germs and from nothing else, then the weight of these germs must be equal to the weight of the universe. You cannot get out of a thing more than is in it. It is a maxim of philosophy. Evolution implies previous involution. And the axiom that every effect must have an adequate cause demands that the involution must be equal to the evolution. You cannot evolve what was not involved. End quote. The answer of the contemporary scientist is to deny all such quote-unquote laws in argument, while operating in terms of them in research. The essential point, however, is this: a philosophy of process asserts a mature potentiality in man and creation. A biblical philosophy asserts a mature creation. The difference in perspective now becomes apparent. A mature potentiality means that man's present problem is finitude. A mature creation means that man's problem is ethical, is sin. In terms of a mature creation, process exists, but it is not biological process from amoeba to man and man to Superman, but biological decay and death. Historically, process is the development of man in terms of his implications, in terms of ethical and epistemological self-consciousness. Man is not moving from non-being into being, nor is his a perpetual becoming. He is a creature created in the image of God, moving either in terms of making his fall or his creation image explicit. Culturally, he develops either the implications of his apostasy into the total solipsism of autonomy from God, or in terms of the image of God, man becomes king over creation and its priest and prophet under God. Moreover, in a mature creation, the standard is a creation wholly good as well as mature, so that the normal is not the statistical average, i.e., sickly and diseased in the main, but the new creation in Jesus Christ. With reference to man specifically, the mature man as created in Adam and recreated in Jesus Christ is the standard. Since man was created full-grown and mature, this maturity is normative in his biology and in his psychology. In an evolving creation, the quote-unquote germ, with its potential, is the law and the standard, so that what Van Til has called integration into the void prevails. Thus, for Freud, childhood and the unconscious are determinative of man, in that the child and the pre-conscious existence of man are more basic and original than the mature man, a latecomer on the scene. Thus, Ralph Waldo Gerard, M.D., Director of Laboratories at the University of Michigan's Mental Research Institute, can assert that, quote, the sleeping rather than the waking state seems to be the more primitive and the preferred one, end quote. From the biblical perspective, any such preference is sin, and man's infantilism is rebellion against his being, which is to be a mature man in God's image. Man is not struggling towards this maturity, but is in flight from it. He has not struggled to consciousness, but is in war against it and in flight from it, because it thunders with demands that he be a responsible and mature man under God. Biblical process is therefore in terms of the development of the responsibilities of the mature creature, or the development of the implications of the headlong flight from that maturity. The concept of evolutionary process is, by its adherents, used in a double sense with reference to man, to demean man and yet to exalt him. As against the ethical biblical doctrine of man as created in God's image and responsible to him, there is a studied reduction of man to meaninglessness. His mind, we are told, is nothing but a mechanism, and man an animal. Mind may indeed be ultimately determined to have been no more than, quote, a sort of phylogenetic tumor, end quote, which leads to man's self-destruction, we are warned. Quote, evolution is creative, but its creativity is independent of purpose or design. It is a result of the properties of interacting atoms and molecules. End quote. Mind can thus be viewed as the property of man's nervous system, even as, quote, magnetism is a property of the structure and organization of iron atoms, end quote. Thus, man, created in the image of God, is reduced to a mechanism, quote, probably descended from the chance organization of a few giant molecules, end quote. Then, surprisingly, we are told, quote, but this in no way need militate against the significance and dignity of human life as it has emerged from both biological and social evolution. Men's highly developed cerebral cortex has produced remarkable intellectual achievements, end quote. This paradox stems from the two concepts of ultimacy employed by evolutionists. First, the molecules or atoms are prior, and hence more ultimate, aspects of reality. As a result, the biblical concept of mature man can be riddled with the claims of molecules and the vast ocean of unconsciousness. Man therefore cannot be the man God requires him to be. His physical impulses are more ultimate than any ethics he may have devised or received. The mature man, made little less than heavenly beings, Psalm 8:5, Berkeley version, is instead made little lower than the ultimate and all-powerful molecules. Biblical faith, therefore, in its ethical mandate is seen as hopelessly unrealistic in expecting man to conform to a law so alien to his being. This doctrine of ultimacy is used to undercut the covenant and to vindicate man as a covenant breaker. It denies that man's problem is ethical in order to exalt him metaphysically. This having been accomplished, a second concept of ultimacy is now brought into play. Process in this evolutionary mythology does indeed originate in molecules, and molecules are thus in a very real sense ultimate as against any God who may exist, and they are prior to any ethical and religious covenant that God may claim to be in force. This process, however, points always to a new ultimate in its continual becoming, and since, as many hold, man is now rapidly becoming able to guide his own evolution, man is thus the new ultimate in process. As such, his position has indeed metaphysical, quote, significance and dignity, end quote, because man now has no law outside of himself. He is both molecules, and therefore free from the covenant by their priority, and also man, the ostensibly autonomous ultimate in process, and the interpreter of being and becoming. He is both lawmaker and law, the developing interpretation and the interpreter. As against this, we must assert the doctrine of the mature work of creation, the implications of which are thus stated by Van Til. Quote, if the creation doctrine is thus taken seriously, it follows that the various aspects of created reality must sustain such relations to one another as have been ordained between them by the Creator, as superiors, inferiors, or equals. All aspects being equally created, no one aspect of reality may be regarded as more ultimate than another. Thus the created one and many may in this respect be said to be equal to one another. They are equally derived and equally dependent upon God who sustains them both. The particulars or facts of the universe do and must act in accord with universals or laws. Thus there is order in the created universe. On the other hand, the laws may not and can never reduce the particulars to abstract particulars or reduce their individuality in any manner. The laws are but generalizations of God's method of working with the particulars. God may at any time take one fact and set it into a new relation to created law. That is, there is no inherent reason in the facts or laws themselves why this should not be done. It is this sort of conception of the relation of facts and laws, of the temporal one and many, embedded as it is in that idea of God in which we profess to believe, that we need in order to make room for miracles, and miracles are at the heart of the Christian position. End quote. The ultimacy of God is the issue in the concept of a mature creation.